Ezra Thompson's weathered hands trembled as he set down the phone, his coffee cup clattering against the kitchen table. The sheriff's dispatcher had asked him to repeat his location 3 times, her voice cracking with disbelief. It wasn't a missing person case anymore. It was a crime scene. Dr. Patterson's medical bag crashed to the farmhouse floor, syringes scattering across the worn wooden planks like fallen leaves. Her 70-year-old knees buckled as she stared at the Polaroid photographs spread before them, each image more damning than the last. Sarah's empty apron still hung on the back porch where she'd left it that morning, a single drop of blood dried brown against the faded fabric. Ezra remembered her shy smile just 6 hours ago, how she'd hummed while hanging laundry, the same tune his lost daughter Emma used to sing. "Lock down the compound," he whispered into his cell phone, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting in his chest. What they'd discovered beneath Sacred Heart Ministry would shatter this town's faith forever. And somewhere in those underground chambers, 23 souls were running out of time. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Millbrook, Nebraska had been dying the slow death of forgotten farm towns. Population 847 and shrinking, the community clung to I-80's edge like a weather-beaten sign nobody bothered to read anymore. Young folks fled to Lincoln or Omaha after graduation, leaving behind empty storefronts and elderly residents who remembered when Main Street bustled with life. The corn still grew tall and golden each summer, but the farmers who tended it were graying, their children scattered to cities that promised more than endless horizons and morning chores. Ezra Thompson had watched his neighbors disappear one foreclosure at a time. At 52, he stood as one of the last holdouts, working 800 acres of corn and soybeans that his grandfather had homesteaded in 1923. His weathered hands told stories of decades spent wrestling with stubborn machinery and unforgiving weather, but his tired eyes held secrets darker than any prairie storm. The locals knew him as the quiet widower who'd lost his wife Martha to cancer 3 years back, a man who kept to himself and paid his bills on time. They didn't know that, before inheriting the farm, Ezra Thompson had been Special Agent Thompson of the FBI's Child Crimes Division. The farmhouse sat like a fortress of memories, every room echoing with ghosts of better times. Martha's rose garden still bloomed each spring, though nobody tended it now except the rain and Ezra's guilty conscience. The kitchen table, where they'd shared morning coffee, remained set for 2, a habit he couldn't break, a hope he couldn't abandon. Down the hallway, behind a door he rarely opened, Emma's bedroom waited frozen in time. College acceptance letters yellowed on her desk beside a half-finished scholarship essay about wanting to help missing children find their way home. She'd been 16 when she vanished, walking to her car after volleyball practice on a Tuesday evening that split Ezra's life into before and after. 10 years of searching had yielded nothing but false leads and deepening despair. The FBI had reassigned him to desk duty after his drinking started affecting his judgment, then accepted his early retirement when Martha's diagnosis demanded his full attention. He'd buried his wife believing their daughter was already dead, though hope flickered like a dying ember in his chest every time the phone rang. Sarah Mitchell had appeared at his door on a humid August morning, like an answer to prayers he'd stopped praying. 22 years old, with eyes that held too many secrets for someone barely out of childhood, she'd asked about the handwritten "Help Wanted" sign he'd posted at Kowalski's grocery store. She needed work cleaning houses, she said, and had references from families in neighboring counties. Her voice carried the careful politeness of someone who'd learned to make herself invisible, to ask for nothing beyond basic survival. Something about her triggered every protective instinct Ezra had developed during his years hunting predators who stole innocence for profit. Sarah flinched when doors closed too quickly. avoided eye contact like it might betray dangerous secrets, and moved through his house with the hypervigilance of prey always listening for approaching footsteps. The first red flag came on a Tuesday morning when Sarah discovered Emma's room. Ezra had left the door cracked while fetching cleaning supplies from the basement, and when he returned, he found Sarah standing motionless in the doorway, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the preserved shrine to his lost daughter. The volleyball trophies caught morning sunlight on their dusty shelves, and Emma's homecoming dress still hung in the closet like a ghost waiting for its owner's return. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, backing away as if she'd violated sacred ground. "I didn't mean to—" "It's all right," Ezra said, though his voice caught on the words. "She would have been about your age now." Sarah's reaction puzzled him. Instead of the typical awkward sympathy most people offered, she studied Emma's photographs with the intensity of someone memorizing evidence. Her fingers traced the air above a picture of Emma laughing at the county fair, as if she wanted to touch the image but didn't dare. "She looks like someone I used to know," Sarah murmured, then caught herself. The shutters came down behind her eyes, and she returned to her cleaning with mechanical precision. Wednesday brought fresh bruises on Sarah's wrists, purple fingerprints that she tried to hide beneath long sleeves despite the August heat. When Ezra asked about them, she delivered a rehearsed explanation about falling off her bicycle, but her story had holes big enough to drive a tractor through. Millbrook was flat as a pancake. Where exactly did one fall hard enough to leave handprint bruises? Thursday's revelation came when Sarah examined every window latch and door lock in his house with the methodical thoroughness of someone planning an escape route. She tested the sliding chains, memorized which hinges squeaked, and timed how long it took to move from the kitchen to the back door. When she thought he wasn't watching, she practiced the route twice, her movements quick and silent as a frightened deer. Friday afternoon shattered any remaining doubt about Sarah's true circumstances. Ezra was replacing a broken fence post when Pastor David Whitmore's black sedan pulled into his driveway without invitation. The man emerged with the predatory grace of someone accustomed to owning every room he entered, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the humidity, his smile never reaching his pale blue eyes. "Brother Thompson," Pastor David called out, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a television evangelist. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by to check on our dear Sarah's work." Ezra had never attended Sacred Heart Ministry, never claimed to be Pastor David's brother, and the presumption set his teeth on edge. He watched through the kitchen window as the pastor entered his house without knocking, heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath from the living room. The transformation was immediate and complete. Sarah's careful composure crumbled into something that made Ezra's blood run cold, the absolute submission of someone who'd learned that resistance brought consequences worse than compliance. Her shoulders rounded inward, making her seem smaller, younger. She spoke only when spoken to, her voice barely above a whisper. "Have you been taking good care of Brother Thompson's home?" Pastor David asked, running his fingers along the mantelpiece as if inspecting her work. "Yes, Pastor," Sarah replied, her eyes fixed on the floor. "And you've been grateful for this opportunity to serve?" "Yes, Pastor." "Good. Remember, my child, that idle hands are the devil's workshop. We must always stay busy in the Lord's service." The conversation continued in this vein for 20 minutes, spiritual-sounding words that carried undertones of threat and control. Pastor David spoke of Sarah's need for guidance, her debt to the ministry for salvation, the importance of obedience to God's chosen leaders. Through it all, Sarah stood perfectly still, except for a barely perceptible tremor in her hands. When the pastor finally left, Sarah remained frozen in place for a full minute before her knees buckled. She caught herself against the wall, breathing hard, as if she'd just outrun death itself. "Sarah," Ezra said gently, "who is that man to you?" "He's my pastor," she whispered, but the words sounded like a script she'd been forced to memorize. "And what does that mean exactly?" She looked at him then, really looked at him, and Ezra saw something that made his former FBI training kick into overdrive. Behind the fear and submission, Sarah's eyes held the desperate intelligence of someone who'd been screaming silently for help, waiting for someone to notice, someone to care enough to ask the right questions. "He saved me," she said, the words hollow as empty corn husks. "When I had nowhere else to go, he gave me a home at Sacred Heart. I owe him everything." But her body language told a different story. The way she touched her throat when she mentioned the ministry, the involuntary step backward when she said Pastor David's name, the careful way she avoided any mention of family or life before Sacred Heart, everything screamed of someone trapped in a situation they couldn't escape. That evening, a summer storm rolled across the prairie, knocking out power for 3 hours. In the darkness of his kitchen, illuminated only by flickering candles, Sarah's carefully constructed walls finally began to crack. "Sometimes I dream about my mom's voice," she whispered, staring into the flame. "But I can't remember her face anymore. They say that happens when you've been blessed with a new family, when God takes away the pain of your old life." "How long since you've seen her?" Ezra asked. 6 years, since I was 16, Sarah's voice broke on the number. "Pastor David says she didn't want me anymore. That's why I ended up in foster care. He says the ministry is my real family now." Ezra's blood turned to ice water. 6 years. The same amount of time since Emma's disappearance. The same vulnerable age. The same predatory pattern he'd seen in dozens of FBI case files. "Sarah," he said carefully, "do you want to be there? At Sacred Heart?" She looked at him with eyes full of tears she couldn't let fall. "Want? Doesn't matter? There's nowhere else to go." The weekend brought clarity that Ezra wished he could unknow. His old FBI contacts weren't supposed to run unofficial database searches for retired agents, but Detective Ray Martinez in Lincoln owed him more favors than either man cared to count. The results arrived via encrypted email Sunday morning, and each line of information felt like another nail in a coffin Ezra had been building in his mind for days. Sacred Heart Ministries' tax records told a story that made no sense for a legitimate religious organization. Cash donations averaging $200,000 monthly from anonymous benefactors. Property ownership traced through a maze of shell companies registered in Delaware, and expenses that included industrial-grade security systems for what was supposedly a simple rural church. The ministry owned 847 acres on Millbrook's eastern border, isolated land that had once belonged to a defunct cattle ranch, now surrounded by 12-foot fences topped with razor wire. More disturbing were the missing persons reports from surrounding counties. 12 young women between ages 16 and 24 had vanished from foster care facilities, group homes, and homeless shelters within a 200-mile radius over the past 4 years. All had been classified as runaways. All had been forgotten by overwhelmed social services departments and underfunded police forces. None had been found. Sarah Mitchell didn't exist in any database before age 16. No birth certificate, no school records, no medical history. Jennifer Lynn Foster, however, had been reported missing from an Iowa group home 6 years ago. The photograph attached to the missing person report showed the same face, younger and filled with hope, that had since been systematically extinguished. Monday morning, Ezra began what he told himself was casual surveillance. He positioned his pickup truck at the intersection of County Road 15 and Highway 34, where he could observe traffic heading to and from the Sacred Heart compound while pretending to check his mailbox. What he saw over the next 3 days turned his suspicions into cold certainty. The compound operated like a prison disguised as a sanctuary. High-end vehicles arrived at regular intervals, luxury sedans and expensive trucks driven by men who looked like successful businessmen and community leaders. They stayed exactly 2 hours before departing, always alone, always checking their mirrors with the paranoid caution of people engaged in activities that couldn't bear scrutiny. Sarah wasn't the only young woman working as domestic help in Millbrook. As Ezra paid closer attention to his community, he identified at least 6 others who exhibited the same behavioral patterns: the hypervigilance, the careful submission, the way they flinched at unexpected sounds. All supposedly lived at Sacred Heart Ministry. All worked cleaning houses, cooking meals, and providing services for families who paid Pastor David directly rather than the women themselves. The breaking point came Wednesday evening when Ezra followed Sarah's route home after work. The gravel road to Sacred Heart wound through cornfields that provided perfect cover for observation, and what he witnessed through his binoculars made his hands shake with rage and recognition. The compound resembled a military installation more than a place of worship. Motion sensor lights swept the perimeter every 30 seconds. Guard towers disguised as bell towers commanded perfect sight lines across the approach roads. German shepherds patrolled the fence line with handlers who carried firearms and radio equipment. This wasn't a ministry. It was a fortress designed to keep people in rather than welcome them. Sarah's living quarters occupied what had once been horse stables, converted into dormitory-style rooms with barred windows and doors that locked from the outside. Through his binoculars, Ezra counted at least 15 young women moving between buildings, all wearing identical gray dresses, all moving with the same defeated posture he'd seen in trafficking victims during his FBI years. The final piece of evidence came Thursday afternoon when Sheriff Bill Morrison's patrol car pulled up to the compound's main gate. Instead of conducting any official business, Morrison was greeted like an expected guest. Pastor David emerged from the main building carrying a manila envelope, which he handed to the sheriff through his car window. The exchange lasted less than 5 minutes, but Ezra's law enforcement experience told him everything he needed to know about the contents of that envelope. Morrison was on Pastor David's payroll. That evening, Ezra created an opportunity for private conversation by asking Sarah to stay late and help him organize Emma's belongings. The task was emotionally brutal for both of them, but it provided cover for the questions he needed to ask. "The other women who work in town," he said carefully, "do they all live at Sacred Heart too?" Sarah's hands stilled on the stack of Emma's school photographs. "We're all blessed to have homes there." "Blessed," Ezra repeated. "Is that how you'd describe it?" She set down the photographs and looked at him with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone who should have been planning her future instead of surviving her present. "Mr. Thompson, there are things you don't understand about people like me." "People like you?" "Damaged goods. Girls who've been thrown away by everyone who was supposed to love them." Her voice carried the flat acceptance of someone who'd been told these lies so often they'd become truth. "Pastor David gives us purpose when the world has none for us." "And what purpose is that?" Sarah's composure cracked slightly. "To serve, to be grateful, to remember that we're lucky anyone wants us at all." The words hit Ezra like physical blows. This was the same psychological manipulation he'd seen in dozens of trafficking cases. Convince the victims they were worthless, that their captors were saviors, that escape meant returning to lives worse than death. "Sarah," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "do you remember what happened to my daughter?" She nodded, tears threatening to spill over. "She disappeared 6 years ago. Same age you were when you came to Sacred Heart. Same situation, vulnerable, alone, needing help. He pulled out Emma's missing person photograph, the one that had been distributed to every law enforcement agency in 3 states. "Have you ever seen her before?" Sarah's reaction was immediate and devastating. Her face went white as corn silk, and her hands began to shake uncontrollably. She stared at Emma's photograph with the horror of someone recognizing a ghost. "Where?" Ezra whispered. "Where did you see her?" "The facility in Kansas," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "4 years ago, before they moved me here. She was special to Pastor David. He called her his angel of rebellion because she kept trying to organize the others, kept telling us we could escape." "What happened to her?" Sarah's tears finally fell, and with them came the truth Ezra had been dreading and needing in equal measure. "She tried to save us all. Got caught with notes she'd written, plans for getting word to the outside. They made us watch when—" Her voice broke completely. "When what, Sarah?" "When they killed her. They said it was a lesson about the consequences of disobedience. But Emma looked right at me before the end. And she whispered something that I've carried with me every day since." "What did she say?" "She said, 'Tell my daddy I love him. Tell him I never stopped fighting.'" The truth about Emma's death broke something fundamental in Ezra's chest, but it also crystallized his purpose with diamond-hard clarity. His daughter had died fighting for others, and her final words carried a responsibility he couldn't ignore. As Sarah wept at his kitchen table, surrounded by Emma's belongings, Ezra made a decision that would either save lives or destroy his own. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I need you to help me finish what Emma started." Her head snapped up, eyes wide with terror. "You don't understand what they'll do. Pastor David doesn't just punish the person who betrays him. He hurts everyone they care about. The last girl who tried to get word out, they made us watch while they—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but her shaking hands told the story her voice couldn't complete. "How many girls are there now?" 23 at our compound. But there are other places, other facilities across different states. Pastor David calls it his network of salvation. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand, leaving streaks across her dirt-stained fingers. "He's not just running one operation, Mr. Thompson. This is bigger than you can imagine." Over the following week, Sarah revealed the horrifying scope of Sacred Heart Ministry's true purpose. Pastor David had spent 15 years building a sophisticated trafficking network disguised as religious outreach. Young women were recruited from foster care systems, homeless shelters, and bus stations, places where disappearances were expected, where no one asked too many questions about girls who vanished into the night. The religious cover was brilliant in its simplicity. Sacred Heart presented itself as a rehabilitation ministry for troubled youth, complete with tax-exempt status and community respect. Local law enforcement, social services, and government officials saw what they wanted to see: a charitable organization helping society's throwaway children find purpose and redemption. The reality was a carefully orchestrated system of psychological and physical control. Girls were told their families had abandoned them, that Pastor David was their only salvation from lives of drugs, prostitution, and early death. Religious doctrine was twisted into justification for absolute obedience. Resistance was met with punishment so severe it broke the spirit of anyone who witnessed it. Sarah revealed that each girl generated approximately $50,000 annually for the operation through forced labor, domestic servicing, and activities she described only as private appointments with community benefactors. The money funded Pastor David's expanding network while providing him with the political protection that came from having powerful men invested in keeping his secrets buried. "He keeps detailed records," Sarah whispered during one of their clandestine conversations. "Names, dates, amounts paid, photographs of everything. He calls it his insurance policy against anyone who might try to shut him down." The breakthrough came when Dr. Helen Patterson approached Ezra outside the hardware store on a sunny Friday afternoon. The 70-year-old physician had served Millbrook for 40 years, delivering 3 generations of babies and treating everything from farming accidents to end-stage cancer. Her weathered hands still held surgeon's steadiness, but her eyes carried the weight of someone harboring unbearable knowledge. "We need to talk," she said without preamble, "about the ministry, about what I've been forced to witness." In her clinic after hours, Dr. Patterson revealed that she'd been providing medical care for Sacred Heart's victims for the past 5 years. Pastor David had originally approached her with a compelling story about helping troubled girls who'd suffered trauma and needed discreet medical attention. She'd believed his lies until the pattern of injuries became impossible to ignore. Broken bones that had healed wrong because they weren't set properly, signs of systematic malnutrition, evidence of sexual trauma in girls who were supposedly being saved from that very fate. Her voice shook with decades of suppressed guilt. "I documented everything, thinking I might find courage to report it someday. Instead, I became complicit through my silence." She produced boxes of medical records, photographs, and sworn statements she'd written but never filed. The evidence painted a picture of systematic abuse spanning multiple states and hundreds of victims. More importantly, it provided the legal foundation necessary to build a federal case. "Why now?" Ezra asked. "Why are you coming forward after all these years?" "Dr." Patterson's answer came through tears she'd been holding back for too long. "Because yesterday, Pastor David brought me a girl who couldn't have been more than 14. She was pregnant, and he wanted me to take care of the problem quietly. When I refused, he reminded me that my medical license and my grandson's safety both depended on my continued cooperation." The threat against her family had finally broken the fear that kept her silent. She was ready to fight, but she needed help from someone with the skills and knowledge to take on an operation this sophisticated and dangerous. Sarah's revelation about her real background came 3 days later, delivered with the careful precision of someone who'd been carrying secrets too dangerous to share. They were walking through Martha's overgrown rose garden when she stopped beside the memorial stone Ezra had placed among the flowers. "My real name is Jennifer Lynn Foster," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "I've been an undercover FBI agent for the past 3 years. The words hit Ezra like a physical blow. Everything he thought he knew about Sarah, every protective instinct she'd triggered, every feeling that had developed between them, all of it built on a foundation of professional deception. "The Bureau has been investigating Sacred Heart and Pastor David's network since 2019, she continued. "We knew about the trafficking, the political corruption, the financial crimes, but we needed someone inside to gather evidence that would hold up in federal court." Jennifer explained that she'd volunteered for the deep cover assignment after her own younger sister disappeared into a similar operation 5 years earlier. The Bureau had provided her with a carefully constructed backstory, complete with false documentation and a tragic background designed to make her appealing to traffickers who preyed on vulnerable young women. "Everything I told you about my past was a lie," she said, her professional composure finally cracking. "Except for one thing, the part about feeling grateful for your kindness. That was real. You treating me like a human being instead of a victim or an asset. That kept me sane when the operation almost broke me." The emotional complexity of the situation overwhelmed Ezra's ability to process it rationally. The woman he'd developed feelings for was a federal agent. The victim he'd wanted to save was actually his professional superior in terms of training and experience. The rescue mission he'd been planning was already part of a larger federal operation that had been years in the making. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Do you arrest me for interfering with a federal investigation?" Jennifer's laugh held no humor. Actually, you accelerated our timeline in the best possible way. Your investigation and Dr. Patterson's evidence provide exactly what we needed to move forward with simultaneous raids on all 15 facilities in Pastor David's network. She explained that the Bureau had identified Sacred Heart compounds in 8 states, each operating under different religious or charitable organizations, but all connected through financial records and personnel transfers. The evidence Ezra and Dr. Patterson had gathered provided the final pieces necessary to coordinate a massive federal operation. We're looking at rescuing over 400 victims and arresting approximately 200 suspects, including law enforcement officials in 6 different counties, Jennifer said. Your daughter's death helped make this possible, Mr. Thompson. Emma's courage inspired Sarah to keep detailed records of everything she witnessed. Those records became the foundation of our entire case. The revelation that Emma's rebellion had continued to save lives, even after her death, provided a measure of peace that Ezra hadn't felt in 10 years. His daughter hadn't died in vain. Her courage had planted seeds that were finally bearing fruit in the form of justice for hundreds of other victims. But Jennifer's final revelation carried devastating urgency that transformed their careful planning into desperate action. Pastor David had received intelligence about increased federal attention on his operations. In response, he was accelerating plans to move all current victims to facilities in Mexico where they would disappear forever into international trafficking networks. The transport is scheduled for this weekend, Jennifer said, her professional calm finally giving way to panic. If we don't move now, 23 women disappear and we lose years of investigative work. Worse, we lose any chance of saving them. The federal operation required another 2 weeks of coordination to execute properly. Local law enforcement couldn't be trusted due to corruption concerns. Mexican authorities were either compromised or unable to provide assistance across international borders. The window for rescue was closing rapidly, and the stakes had never been higher. So, what are you saying? Ezra asked, though he already knew the answer. I'm saying that sometimes individual action is the only option when institutional response fails, Jennifer replied. I'm saying that if someone were to take direct action to prevent those women from being transported to Mexico, the federal government might be very grateful for that person's initiative. That evening, sitting in Emma's preserved bedroom, surrounded by evidence of a life cut short by the same evil they were fighting, Ezra and Jennifer finalized plans that would either save 23 lives or get them both killed. The moral calculus was simple, even if the practical execution would be anything but. Emma had died trying to save others, and they were going to finish what she started. If we do this, Ezra said, there's no going back, no legal protection if things go wrong. Jennifer's response carried the weight of someone who'd been preparing for this moment her entire career. My sister's name was Rebecca. She was 17 when she vanished. If there's even a chance of preventing other families from living with that pain, then we have to try. Outside Emma's window, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and somewhere in a compound 5 miles away, 23 women waited for salvation that might never come. Friday evening arrived with the weight of finality pressing down on Millbrook like an approaching thunderstorm. The plan they'd constructed over sleepless nights and whispered conversations was audacious in its simplicity. Ezra would pose as a potential major donor during Sacred Heart's monthly benefactor gathering, while Jennifer created a distraction from inside the compound that would allow them to document the trafficking operation and extract as many victims as possible before the weekend transport to Mexico. Dr. Patterson had provided crucial intelligence about the compound's layout, gleaned from 5 years of reluctant medical visits. The main sanctuary served as a meeting hall where Pastor David conducted his spiritual presentations for donors, carefully choreographed performances designed to showcase the ministry's supposed rehabilitation success while allowing wealthy patrons to select which girls would be assigned to their private service. Beneath the sanctuary, a network of basement rooms and converted storm cellars held the victims in conditions that made medieval dungeons seem humane. The evening's gathering would include approximately 50 men from across 3 states, each paying between $10,000 and $50,000 for annual membership in Pastor David's exclusive ministry. Local law enforcement would be conspicuously absent, as Sheriff Morrison always ensured his deputies were conveniently busy with other duties during Sacred Heart events. The compound's private security force consisted of 12 armed men who'd been carefully selected for their willingness to follow orders without asking moral questions. Ezra's cover story positioned him as Robert Henderson, a recently widowed cattle rancher from Wyoming whose substantial life insurance settlement had left him seeking meaningful ways to honor his deceased wife's memory through charitable giving. Jennifer had provided him with detailed financial documentation, references from legitimate Wyoming religious organizations, and a carefully crafted backstory that would appeal to Pastor David's ego and greed. As sunset painted the Nebraska sky in shades of blood and gold, Ezra adjusted his tie one final time and checked the miniature recording equipment hidden in his jacket pocket. The wire was FBI standard issue, capable of capturing audio and transmitting GPS coordinates to federal receivers positioned 20 miles away. If everything went according to plan, tonight's recordings would provide the evidence necessary to bring down the entire network. The Sacred Heart compound looked different in the gathering dusk, its facade of religious serenity more convincing when softened by twilight shadows. Luxury vehicles filled the gravel parking area, Mercedes sedans, BMW SUVs, and pickup trucks that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Ezra recognized several license plates from his surveillance notes, including one belonging to a state senator and another registered to a prominent Omaha businessman who'd recently been featured in newspaper articles about his charitable contributions to youth programs. Pastor David greeted potential donors at the sanctuary entrance with the practiced warmth of a seasoned politician. At 54, he maintained the kind of polished appearance that spoke of expensive grooming and careful attention to image management. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his suit tailored to disguise a body soft from good living, and his smile never wavered even when his pale blue eyes assessed each arrival with predatory calculation. "Brother Henderson," Pastor David said, extending a firm handshake that lingered just long enough to establish dominance. "Welcome to Sacred Heart Ministry." "I trust your journey from Wyoming wasn't too arduous." "The Lord's work is never arduous, Pastor," Ezra replied, falling into the role with ease learned from years of undercover FBI operations. "I'm eager to see how your ministry transforms broken lives into testimonies of redemption." The sanctuary had been arranged like a theater, with cushioned chairs facing a raised platform where Pastor David would deliver his presentation. The walls displayed carefully selected photographs of young women engaged in wholesome activities, reading Bibles, tending gardens, preparing meals, all designed to reinforce the narrative of rehabilitation and spiritual growth. What the photographs didn't show were the bars on the windows, the locks on the doors, or the fear in the subject's eyes that no amount of careful lighting could completely disguise. As the evening's program began, Ezra found himself surrounded by men whose appearance of respectability masked appetites that would have made medieval demons proud. They spoke in coded language about sponsoring specific ministrations, private spiritual counseling sessions, and intensive rehabilitation programs that required hands-on involvement from concerned benefactors. The religious terminology provided a veneer of legitimacy for transactions that were fundamentally commercial and fundamentally evil. Pastor David's presentation masterfully combined genuine theological knowledge with psychological manipulation designed to make his audience feel both righteous and entitled. He spoke eloquently about society's obligation to save fallen women who'd been corrupted by drugs, prostitution, and moral decay. The ministry, he explained, provided these damaged souls with structure, purpose, and the firm guidance necessary to overcome their inherent weaknesses. "Gentlemen," Pastor David continued, his voice taking on the hypnotic cadence of a practiced preacher, "we are not merely running a charity. We are conducting a holy war against the forces that would destroy our daughters, our communities, our very civilization. These young women come to us broken beyond conventional repair, and through our dedicated intervention, they discover their true calling as servants of God's greater purpose." The audience nodded approvingly, their faces reflecting the satisfaction of men who'd found moral justification for immoral desires. Ezra's recording equipment captured every word, every financial detail, every casual reference to activities that would generate federal trafficking charges carrying life sentences. The evening's climax came when Pastor David invited his guests to meet some of the ministry's success stories. 23 young women filed into the sanctuary with the mechanical precision of soldiers following orders they dared not question. Each wore identical gray dresses that emphasized their youth while minimizing their individuality. Their heads were bowed in practiced submission, their movements carefully choreographed to demonstrate the complete obedience that Pastor David's benefactors found so appealing. Ezra's blood turned to ice water when he recognized Jennifer among the lineup. Her transformation was complete. The confident federal agent had vanished, replaced by a broken girl whose very posture screamed of someone who'd learned that survival depended on absolute compliance. The psychological toll of maintaining deep cover for 3 years was written in every line of her body, every carefully controlled expression that revealed nothing of the intelligence and determination burning beneath the surface. Each of these precious souls represents a victory against darkness, Pastor David announced, gesturing toward the women with proprietary pride. They have learned the joy of service, the peace that comes from accepting their place in God's divine order. They ask for nothing except the opportunity to express their gratitude through humble obedience. What followed was a grotesque parody of a social gathering, as wealthy men circulated among the victims with the casual brutality of livestock buyers examining potential purchases. Conversations were conducted in euphemisms and religious language, but the underlying transactions were transparently commercial. Monthly sponsorships ranged from $5,000 to $20,000 depending on age, appearance, and what Pastor David delicately termed special accommodations. Jennifer caught Ezra's eye across the room, her barely perceptible nod confirming that she'd identified the basement access points and security rotations. According to their plan, she would excuse herself from the gathering in exactly 15 minutes, using a predetermined medical emergency that would require her to return to the dormitory area. Once there, she would begin evacuating as many women as possible through the service entrance that Dr. Patterson had identified during her coerced medical visits. The signal came when Pastor David called for a brief intermission in the evening's program, allowing his guests to fellowship privately with ministry participants. As conversations became more explicit and handshake agreements sealed arrangements that would have made slave traders blush, Jennifer pressed her hand to her forehead and whispered something to the woman beside her. "Pastor David," she said, her voice carrying just the right note of distressed femininity, "I'm not feeling well. May I please return to my room?" Pastor David's response revealed the depth of his psychological control over his victims. Instead of showing concern for her well-being, he studied her with the cold calculation of someone assessing whether a valuable asset was malfunctioning. His pale eyes searched her face for signs of deception or rebellion before he granted permission with a dismissive wave. "Sister Sarah may be excused," he announced to the gathering, using the false name that had been Jennifer's identity for 3 years. Perhaps the excitement of meeting so many generous benefactors has overwhelmed her delicate constitution. The patronizing laughter that greeted this comment made Ezra's hands clench into fists, but he maintained his cover as Jennifer walked toward the sanctuary exit with downcast eyes and shuffling steps. Every instinct screamed at him to follow her, to provide backup for what came next, but their plan required him to remain in position for another 10 minutes to avoid raising suspicion. Those 10 minutes stretched like hours as Ezra listened to conversations that would fuel his nightmares for years to come. Men discussed their charitable contributions with the same casual tone they might use to debate golf handicaps or investment strategies. The complete absence of human empathy, the reduction of young women to commodities for purchase and consumption, the religious language used to justify unconscionable evil. All of it was being captured by his recording equipment, but the knowledge provided little comfort when measured against the suffering he was witnessing. When Ezra finally excused himself from the gathering, claiming a need for fresh air, the compound's exterior lighting revealed Jennifer moving between buildings with systematic efficiency. She'd already reached the dormitory complex and was implementing the evacuation procedure they'd rehearsed until every step was automatic. Through his earpiece, he could hear her whispered updates as she moved from room to room, gathering women who'd been told for years that escape was impossible. The plan was working perfectly until Pastor David's voice echoed across the compound through strategically placed speakers, his tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience and the barely controlled rage of a predator whose prey was escaping. All ministry participants will report to the sanctuary immediately for emergency spiritual counsel. Anyone found outside designated areas will face immediate disciplinary action. The word sent ice through Ezra's veins as he realized their carefully constructed plan had just collapsed into chaos that would either save 23 lives or get them all killed in the attempt. Pastor David's announcement transformed the compound from a place of forced tranquility into a prison on high alert. Floodlights blazed to life across the facility, turning night into harsh, artificial day that eliminated every shadow where someone might hide. Armed security guards emerged from concealed positions, their radio chatter crackling through the air as they coordinated a systematic search of every building, every room, every possible hiding place where missing inventory might be concealed. Ezra pressed himself against the side of the maintenance shed, his heart hammering as he watched the organized chaos unfold around him. Through his earpiece, Jennifer's voice came in desperate whispers as she attempted to move 12 women through corridors that were rapidly filling with guards conducting room-by-room searches. "They're doing a head count," she breathed, her words barely audible over the sounds of shouting and running footsteps. "Pastor David knows exactly how many are supposed to be here. We've got maybe 5 minutes before they realize half the dormitory is empty." The mathematics of their situation were brutally simple. 12 women were already with Jennifer, moving toward the service entrance that represented their only hope of escape. 11 others remained in the sanctuary, still trapped in the grotesque social gathering that continued as if nothing was wrong. The men purchasing their services seemed oblivious to the emergency unfolding around them, too focused on their negotiations to notice the tension radiating from Pastor David's forced smile. Ezra's training kicked in as he assessed tactical options with the cold clarity that had kept him alive during his most dangerous FBI operations. The service entrance was 200 yards away across open ground, now illuminated by searchlights. The main gate was locked and guarded by armed men with instructions to shoot anyone attempting unauthorized departure. And the fence surrounding the property was 12 feet high, topped with razor wire and equipped with motion sensors that would trigger additional alarms. The only advantage they possessed was the element of surprise, and that was evaporating with each passing second. Jennifer's group had reached the kitchen building when the first wave of security guards discovered the empty dormitory rooms. Their shouted reports echoed across the compound like gunshots, galvanizing the search effort into coordinated pursuit. Pastor David's voice boomed through the speaker system again, his carefully modulated preacher's tone replaced by the raw authority of someone whose criminal empire was under direct assault. "This is a test of faith," he announced, his words carrying across the compound with terrifying conviction. "Satan has sent agents of corruption to destroy our holy work, but we shall not be moved. All security personnel will implement Protocol 7 immediately. No one enters or leaves this facility until every soul has been accounted for." Protocol 7, according to intelligence Jennifer had gathered during her 3 years undercover, was Pastor David's emergency response plan for law enforcement raids or other existential threats to the operation. It involved lockdown procedures, evidence destruction, and elimination of potential witnesses who might testify against the organization. In practical terms, it was a death sentence for anyone caught attempting to escape or expose the ministry's true purpose. The kitchen building's service door burst open as Jennifer led her group of rescued women into the open courtyard. They moved in single file, holding hands to maintain contact in the chaos, their gray dresses making them nearly invisible against the concrete walls. But the floodlights caught them as they crossed the space between buildings, and suddenly the night erupted with shouts of discovery and pursuit. "There! By the kitchen! Stop them!" Gunfire shattered the darkness as security guards opened fire without regard for their own safety or the safety of the women they were pursuing. Bullets sparked off concrete walls and shattered windows as Ezra broke from his concealment and sprinted toward Jennifer's position, his own weapon drawn and ready. The tactical situation deteriorated into complete chaos as 12 terrified women scattered in different directions, their years of psychological conditioning finally overcome by desperate survival instinct. Some ran toward the fence, others sought shelter in nearby buildings, and a few simply froze in place as their minds struggled to process the violence erupting around them. Jennifer stood in the center of the chaos, her federal training finally visible as she organized defensive positions and returned fire while trying to maintain control over women who'd been trained to be helpless. The transformation was startling. The broken victim vanished, replaced by a seasoned agent whose 3 years of deep cover had culminated in this moment of truth. "Ezra!" she shouted over the gunfire. "The main sanctuary! Pastor David's trying to move the others!" Through the windows of the main building, Ezra could see Pastor David herding the remaining 11 women toward what appeared to be a concealed basement entrance. The wealthy benefactors who'd been enjoying their grotesque social gathering were now scrambling for their vehicles, unwilling to risk exposure in what had clearly become a law enforcement operation. The moral calculus was devastating in its simplicity. Ezra could help Jennifer's group escape through the service entrance, potentially saving 12 lives but losing 11 others to whatever fate Pastor David had planned for witnesses to his empire's collapse. Or he could attempt to reach the sanctuary and prevent the remaining women from disappearing into basement chambers that might become their tombs. Emma's voice seemed to whisper in his memory, carrying the message Sarah had delivered in his kitchen what felt like a lifetime ago. "Tell my daddy I love him. Tell him I never stopped fighting." The decision made itself. "Get them out!" Ezra shouted to Jennifer as he turned toward the main sanctuary. "I'm going after the others!" His sprint across the compound's central courtyard felt like running through a gauntlet of hell. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness as security guards concentrated their fire on anyone moving without authorization. Bullets whined past his ears and kicked up concrete fragments around his feet. But Emma's memory drove him forward with the relentless momentum of someone who'd already lost everything that mattered. The sanctuary's main door was locked, but years of farm work had given Ezra the physical strength to handle obstacles that would stop most men his age. He put his shoulder to the heavy wooden barrier and felt it splinter under the impact, the crash of breaking timber announcing his arrival to everyone inside. Pastor David stood on the raised platform where he'd delivered his evening's presentation, no longer the polished religious leader, but revealed as the desperate criminal he'd always been beneath the facade. In his hand, he held a pistol pointed at the 11 women huddled against the far wall, their faces reflecting the absolute terror of people who understood they were about to die. "Brother Henderson," Pastor David said, his voice carrying the same calm authority he'd used during his theological presentations. Or should I say, Agent Thompson? "Did you really think your clumsy investigation would go unnoticed by someone who spent 15 years staying ahead of federal law enforcement?" The revelation that his cover had been blown hit Ezra like a physical blow, but it also explained how quickly the compound's security had responded to their escape attempt. Pastor David had been playing with them from the beginning, allowing their plans to develop while preparing countermeasures that would eliminate all witnesses to his operation. "These women are going to die tonight," Pastor David continued conversationally, as if discussing weather rather than mass murder. "You and your federal partner are going to die tonight. And tomorrow, Sacred Heart Ministry will relocate to facilities where government interference will be considerably less problematic." Behind Pastor David, Ezra could see a concealed stairway leading down into basement levels that hadn't appeared on any of the architectural plans they'd studied. The implications were horrifying. How many other victims were hidden in those underground chambers? How many women had disappeared into that darkness over the past 15 years? "But before we conclude tonight's business," Pastor David said, his weapon steady despite the chaos erupting outside, "I want you to understand something about your daughter, Emma. She died because she couldn't accept the natural order that places some people above others. She died because she refused to acknowledge that her purpose was to serve rather than rebel." The words were calculated to break Ezra's focus, to provoke the kind of emotional response that would make him an easy target. But instead of rage or grief, Emma's memory filled him with the cold clarity of purpose that had made him effective during his most dangerous FBI operations. "You're wrong about something," Ezra said, his voice steady as granite. "Emma didn't die because she rebelled. She died because she succeeded. Everything you built here, everything you thought was permanent, it's already over." The sound of approaching sirens in the distance confirmed what Pastor David's widening eyes had already begun to suspect. Jennifer's federal backup had finally arrived, and Sacred Heart Ministries' 15-year reign of terror was entering its final moments. The sirens that had given Ezra hope turned into his worst nightmare as Sheriff Morrison's patrol cars arrived first, their flashing lights cutting through the compound's darkness like harbingers of corruption rather than justice. Through the sanctuary windows, Ezra watched Morrison's deputies establish a perimeter around the facility, not to apprehend the criminals inside, but to contain the federal operation that threatened to expose 15 years of systematic complicity. "Ah, Sheriff Morrison," Pastor David said without taking his eyes off Ezra, his weapon still trained on the 11 terrified women. "Right on schedule. I trust you've prepared the usual explanations for tonight's unfortunate events." Morrison's voice crackled through a radio at Pastor David's belt, the sheriff's words carrying the casual authority of someone who'd been managing cover-ups for years. "Federal agents have been neutralized at the perimeter. We've got maybe 20 minutes before their backup arrives from Lincoln. Recommend immediate implementation of Protocol 7 and facility sterilization." The blood in Ezra's veins turned to ice water as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Morrison wasn't just taking bribes, he was an active partner in Pastor David's operation, using his law enforcement authority to eliminate threats and cover up evidence. Jennifer's federal backup wasn't coming to rescue them. They'd been intercepted and probably killed by corrupt deputies who'd been waiting for exactly this scenario. Protocol 7, as Jennifer had explained during their planning sessions, included the elimination of all witnesses who could testify against the organization. The women cowering against the sanctuary wall weren't just victims of trafficking. They were living evidence of crimes that could bring down politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials across multiple states. Their continued existence represented an unacceptable risk to powerful men who'd invested heavily in maintaining the status quo. "You see, Agent Thompson," Pastor David continued, his preacher's cadence returning as he delivered what was clearly intended as Ezra's eulogy, "this operation enjoys protection at levels you couldn't imagine. Federal investigations are diverted, redirected, or simply buried in bureaucratic procedures that ensure nothing meaningful ever reaches prosecution. We've had 3 years to study your partner's activities, and everything she discovered has been carefully documented and contained." The revelation that Jennifer's entire operation had been compromised from the beginning hit Ezra like a physical blow. 3 years of undercover work, 3 years of psychological torture endured to gather evidence, 3 years of believing she was building a case that would save hundreds of victims. All of it had been theater performed for an audience that was already planning to eliminate every participant. Jennifer doesn't know, Ezra realized aloud. Agent Santos remains blissfully unaware that her federal communications have been monitored since day 1 of her assignment, Pastor David confirmed. Her superiors in the Bureau believe she's investigating a small-scale trafficking operation confined to rural Nebraska. They have no idea about the scope of our network or the level of political protection we enjoy. Outside, the sounds of gunfire had stopped, replaced by the organized efficiency of Morrison's deputies establishing control over the compound. Through his earpiece, Ezra could hear Jennifer's increasingly desperate attempts to contact federal backup that would never arrive. Her voice carried the growing panic of someone realizing that rescue had transformed into a trap designed to eliminate everyone with knowledge of Sacred Heart's true purpose. The basement stairway behind Pastor David suddenly erupted with movement as figures emerged from the underground chambers. But instead of more victims, Ezra found himself staring at faces he recognized from newspaper photos and community events. Prominent businessmen, local politicians, and law enforcement officials who'd built their public reputations on platforms of family values and community protection. Among them, Ezra's heart shattered completely as he recognized a face that had haunted his dreams for 10 years. Emma Thompson stood at the top of the basement stairs, but the daughter he'd searched for was gone, replaced by someone whose eyes held the flat emptiness of complete psychological destruction. She moved with the mechanical obedience of a broken doll, her beautiful face unmarked by physical abuse but carrying scars that went deeper than any wound. "Emma," Ezra whispered, the name torn from his throat like a piece of his soul. She looked at him without recognition, her gaze sliding past his face as if he were furniture rather than the father who'd never stopped searching for her. 10 years of systematic psychological torture had erased every memory of her previous life, every connection to the family that had loved her, every trace of the rebellious spirit that had inspired other victims to resist their captors. "Say hello to your father, Angel," Pastor David commanded, and Emma's response demonstrated the complete success of his conditioning program. "Hello?" she said in a voice devoid of emotion, her words carrying no more warmth than if she'd been greeting a stranger on the street. Pastor David's smile carried the satisfaction of someone unveiling his masterpiece. "Emma has become our most successful rehabilitation project. After her unfortunate attempt at rebellion 10 years ago, we implemented specialized therapeutic interventions that helped her understand her true purpose. She now serves as an example to other troubled girls about the peace that comes from accepting God's plan for their lives." The psychological torture that had transformed his vibrant, rebellious daughter into this hollow shell was more devastating than her death would have been. Death, at least, would have preserved the memory of who she'd been. This was something worse. The complete erasure of her personality, her spirit, her very self. The beauty of our rehabilitation program, Pastor David continued, is that it creates perfect witnesses for federal investigators. Emma will testify that she chose to remain at Sacred Heart, that she's grateful for our intervention in her troubled life, and that any allegations of misconduct are fabrications created by unstable individuals with personal vendettas against our ministry. Morrison's voice crackled through the radio again, adding urgency to an already desperate situation. Pastor, we've got federal vehicles approaching from 3 directions. Real FBI this time, with warrants and tactical support. Recommend immediate evacuation to the Mexico facilities. The basement stairway revealed its true purpose as an escape tunnel leading to underground transportation systems that connected Sacred Heart to a network of similar facilities across international borders. The prominent citizens who'd emerged from below were already moving toward hidden exits, their political protection extending to extraction procedures that would place them beyond the reach of American law enforcement. "This is where we part company, Agent Thompson," Pastor David said, backing toward the stairway while keeping his weapon trained on the terrified women. "These girls will accompany us to facilities where they can continue their spiritual development without interference from misguided federal agents. Emma will help them understand that resistance only leads to suffering." But as Pastor David reached the top of the stairs, something shifted in Emma's empty eyes. For just a moment, some buried spark of recognition flickered across her face as she looked at her father. Her hand moved almost imperceptibly toward a concealed object at her waist, something that caught the sanctuary's lighting with metallic gleam. "Angel," Pastor David commanded, his voice carrying the authority that had controlled her for a decade. "Take your sisters downstairs." It's time for their next lesson in obedience. Emma's response came in a voice that carried echoes of the daughter Ezra remembered, the girl who'd wanted to help missing children find their way home. "Yes, Pastor," she said, but her eyes were locked on her father's face. "I understand my purpose now." The knife appeared in her hand with practiced smoothness, and suddenly Pastor David's carefully controlled empire collapsed into chaos as his most perfect victim revealed that some sparks of rebellion could never be completely extinguished. Emma's psychological programming had been thorough, but it had been built on top of a foundation that Pastor David had never fully understood. The same unbreakable core of moral courage that had driven her original resistance and now erupted in one final act of defiance. "Tell my daddy I love him," she whispered, her words carrying across the sanctuary as she drove the blade into Pastor David's chest with the precision of someone who'd spent 10 years learning anatomy through forced medical procedures. "Tell him I never stopped fighting." The gunshot that followed came from Pastor David's reflexive finger on the trigger, but his aim was destroyed by shock and pain. The bullet went wide, shattering stained glass windows as Emma collapsed beside him, her own blood mixing with his on the sanctuary floor. In that moment of horrific violence and heartbreaking reunion, the sound of genuine federal sirens approached from multiple directions as real FBI tactical teams surrounded the compound. Jennifer's backup had finally arrived, guided by GPS coordinates from the recording equipment that had continued transmitting throughout the night's chaos. The truth was about to be revealed, but the cost of that revelation was measured in broken lives and shattered families that could never be fully repaired. 6 months after the Sacred Heart compound raid, Ezra Thompson stood in the doorway of a specialized trauma recovery facility in Colorado, watching his daughter Emma work in the art therapy garden. The woman tending tomato plants with careful concentration bore little resemblance to either the broken shell he'd found in Pastor David's sanctuary or the vibrant teenager who'd vanished 10 years earlier. This version of Emma was something entirely new, a survivor rebuilding herself from fragments of memory and flickers of hope. The official statistics from the federal operation told a story that would reshape how America understood domestic trafficking. 412 victims rescued from 15 facilities across 8 states. 237 arrests, including 12 law enforcement officials, 6 judges, and a sitting state senator. Financial assets totaling $47 million seized and redirected to victim compensation and recovery programs. The Sacred Heart Network had been completely dismantled, its political protection eliminated through prosecutions that reached into the highest levels of state and federal government, but statistics couldn't capture the human cost of 15 years of systematic evil or the miracle of healing that followed its destruction. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the facility's director, had explained Emma's condition with the gentle honesty that marked all of her interactions with traumatized families. Your daughter survived by compartmentalizing her memories and emotions so completely that she essentially created a separate identity. The Emma who endured Pastor David's conditioning exists separately from the Emma who remembers being your daughter. Integration therapy helps her access both parts of herself while building new neural pathways that aren't associated with trauma. The process was slow, measured in months rather than weeks, and progress came in increments so small they were barely visible from day to day. A smile that reached her eyes when Ezra brought her favorite books. A question about Martha's garden that indicated recovered memories of home. A nightmare that ended with her calling for her father instead of retreating into catatonic silence. She asked about you yesterday, Dr. Martinez had told him during their weekly consultation. Not as a stranger she'd been told to acknowledge, but as someone she remembered missing. That's significant progress for someone whose survival depended on forgetting that love ever existed. Jennifer had visited the facility twice, her own recovery complicated by the revelation that her 3-year undercover operation had been compromised from the beginning. The knowledge that her reports had been monitored and her federal contacts infiltrated by the same network she'd been investigating created a crisis of professional identity that required its own specialized treatment. I kept 23 women in slavery for 3 years because I believed I was building a case to save them, she'd confessed during one of their conversations in the facility's family counseling center. Every day, I watched them suffer while collecting evidence that I thought would eventually lead to their freedom. Instead, I was gathering intelligence for the people who owned them. The moral complexity of Jennifer's situation defied easy judgment. Her undercover work had indeed provided crucial evidence for the prosecutions that followed, but only because Pastor David's network had grown overconfident about their political protection. The same surveillance that had monitored her federal communications had also documented the network's expansion, creating an inadvertent paper trail that proved invaluable when honest FBI agents finally gained access to the files. The truth about Sheriff Morrison's corruption had sent shockwaves through Nebraska's law enforcement community. Morrison himself had died during the compound raid, killed by his own deputies when he tried to flee with evidence that would have implicated dozens of other officials. His death ensured that some secrets died with him, but it also eliminated the network's primary law enforcement asset and opened the door for comprehensive reform of rural policing procedures. Dr. Helen Patterson had become something of a reluctant hero in the aftermath of the operation. Her medical records and documentation provided the foundation for many of the federal prosecutions, and her courage in finally speaking out inspired other professionals who'd been coerced into complicity. She'd used her newfound prominence to establish a nonprofit organization dedicated to training healthcare providers to recognize and report signs of human trafficking. I spent 40 years as a physician, and the most important thing I ever did was finding the courage to break my silence, she'd told a congressional committee investigating trafficking in rural communities. Every professional who encounters vulnerable populations has a responsibility that goes beyond their immediate job description. We are the early warning system for crimes that destroy lives and corrupt communities. The Sacred Heart facility itself had been converted into a regional center for trafficking survivors, its isolation now serving as a sanctuary for healing rather than imprisonment. The basement chambers where victims had been held were sealed and turned into memorial spaces, honoring all those who hadn't survived to see justice served. The main sanctuary was renovated into a conference center where law enforcement agencies trained to recognize and combat trafficking operations. Ezra's own transformation had been as profound as any of the other survivors. The farm that had been his prison of grief and alcoholism became a place of renewed purpose. He'd used his portion of the federal reward money to establish scholarship programs for trafficking survivors pursuing higher education, and his testimony before Congress had helped secure funding for rural anti-trafficking initiatives. But the deepest change came from his relationship with Jennifer, which had evolved from professional partnership to something that defied easy categorization. They were both too damaged by their experiences to pursue conventional romance, but they'd found in each other the kind of understanding that could only exist between people who'd stared into the same abyss and chosen to keep fighting. "We're not fixing each other," Jennifer had observed during one of their conversations on Ezra's front porch, Martha's roses blooming around them as summer stretched across the Nebraska prairie. "We're just choosing to be broken together instead of broken alone." Emma's engagement to David Chen, a fellow survivor she'd met during group therapy, represented the kind of hope that had seemed impossible during the darkest days of her recovery. David had survived 5 years in a trafficking operation in California before being rescued by the same federal task force that had grown out of the Sacred Heart investigation. Their relationship was built on shared understanding of trauma and mutual commitment to creating lives defined by more than their suffering. "When I first saw Emma smile at David," Ezra told Dr. Martinez during their final consultation, "I realized she wasn't just remembering how to be happy. She was learning how to be happy in ways she'd never experienced before her abduction. That's a kind of healing I didn't know was possible." The wedding was planned for the following spring in Martha's garden, where Emma had spent countless childhood hours helping her mother tend the roses that still bloomed each year despite neglect and harsh weather. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Beauty that persisted through abandonment, love that survived even death, hope that regenerated from the most unlikely soil. Sarah Mitchell, Jennifer's real name, had officially retired from the FBI to become the Director of Victim Services for the anti-trafficking task force that had emerged from their operation. Her unique perspective as both an agent and someone who'd experienced the psychological warfare of deep cover made her invaluable in helping other survivors navigate the complex journey from victimhood to advocacy. "The work isn't about forgetting what happened to us," she explained to a gathering of survivors at the facility's first annual memorial service. "It's about transforming our experiences into tools for protecting others. Every person we help represents a victory against the forces that tried to destroy us." The memorial service itself had become an annual pilgrimage for survivors, their families, and the law enforcement professionals who dedicated their careers to fighting trafficking. Emma had spoken for the first time that year, her voice steady as she read the names of victims who hadn't survived to see justice served. "My sister Rebecca's name isn't on this memorial wall," Jennifer had said during her own remarks, "because she's still missing somewhere in a system we haven't fully dismantled yet. This work isn't finished until every name is accounted for, until every survivor has the chance to come home." As autumn painted the Nebraska landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Ezra found himself returning again and again to the realization that had sustained him through the darkest moments of his journey. Emma's childhood dream of helping missing children find their way home had come true in ways none of them could have anticipated. Her survival, her recovery, and her transformation into an advocate for other victims represented the fulfillment of a purpose that had been interrupted but never destroyed. Standing in his kitchen on a crisp October morning, setting the table for 3 instead of 2 for the first time in 10 years, Ezra understood that some stories don't end with justice served or families reunited. The best stories continue with the daily choice to build something beautiful from the wreckage of what came before, to plant gardens in places where prisons once stood, and to believe that love really can conquer the darkest forces that threaten to consume the human spirit. Outside his window, Martha's roses prepared for winter dormancy, their annual cycle of death and resurrection promising that spring would come again, that beauty would return, and that even the most broken things could bloom again given enough time, care, and stubborn hope. Sometimes the most profound victories aren't measured in headlines or court verdicts, but in the quiet moments when broken families choose to heal together. Ezra Thompson's story reminds us that it's never too late to fight for what matters most, even when that fight seems impossible, even when the systems we trust have failed us, even when hope feels like a luxury we can't afford. For those of us who've lived long enough to understand that life rarely unfolds according to our carefully laid plans, there's something deeply moving about watching a father refuse to give up on his daughter, a community find courage to stand against corruption, and survivors transform their pain into purpose that protects others. We've all experienced seasons when darkness seemed permanent, when the roses in our gardens looked like they'd never bloom again. But Ezra and Emma's story proves that with enough stubborn love, patient care, and willingness to tend the broken places in our lives, spring always returns. Sometimes the most beautiful gardens grow in soil that's been through the worst storms. The question isn't whether we'll face impossible situations, it's whether we'll choose to keep planting hope when everything around us looks dead. What broken thing in your life are you still tending with hope? Have you ever had to choose between following rules and doing what's right? Share your thoughts below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.